Sometimes the fiercest storms bring the brightest miracles. In a forgotten corner of Montana, a struggling single dad faced a choice few would dare make: to risk everything for two tiny lives trapped in a world of ice and fear. What he didn't know was that this single act of courage would awaken a chain of events that would rebuild not just his broken life, but an entire town's hope. Stay with us. This is not just a story about survival. It's a story about second chances, the power of kindness, and the unexpected roads that lead us home. If you believe in the magic of everyday heroes and the strength of the human spirit, we invite you to subscribe to Soul Moments Story, where each story is a reminder that hope is never truly lost. Now, let's begin. The wind had been murmuring all morning, low and restless, like a dog pacing before a door. Eli Turner stood at the battered threshold of his trailer, mug of lukewarm coffee in hand, and listened. In Montana, you learned to hear a storm before you saw it. Today, the wind carried a promise he knew too well: trouble. The sky overhead was a flat, bruised gray, pressing low against the earth. The kind of sky that warned old-timers to stack firewood high and check the generators twice. Eli glanced across the empty fields stretching beyond his porch, their golden grasses already bowing beneath the invisible hand of the coming blizzard. He took a sip of coffee, wincing at the bitterness. The heater inside his trailer was sputtering again, another thing he couldn't afford to fix. But Eli didn't complain. Complaints didn't mend broken things, and they sure didn't raise a boy or bury a wife. He ran a calloused hand through his thick brown hair, now flecked with early streaks of gray at the temples. His 38 years had carved more than lines into his face. They had etched a quiet resilience into the set of his jaw and the steady way he moved. Turning back inside, Eli shrugged on his heavy flannel coat. He needed to pick up supplies before the storm locked the town down. With a practiced touch, he jiggled the stubborn door latch into place and headed for his pickup truck, a rusted '89 Ford that wheezed to life like an old man rising from a cold bed. As he drove toward town, snowflakes began to fall, soft at first, then faster, angrier, like tiny white knives slashing across his windshield. Visibility shrank with frightening speed. By the time he rolled into the gas station's lot, the town was already hunkering down. Windows boarded, doors locked, lights off. Eli filled up the tank quickly, his breath steaming in the freezing air. A flash of color caught his eye. A battered yellow school bus rumbling past, heading out of town toward the rural backroads. He frowned. What fool would send kids out in this weather? Inside the station, Mrs. Hargrove, the gray-haired owner, was busy stacking canned goods. She glanced up as he entered, her face creased with worry. "Eli, you be careful out there," she said. "They're saying this one's going to be bad." "I'll be quick," he promised, tossing a loaf of bread and a few cans into a plastic basket. "Anybody else still out?" Mrs. Hargrove hesitated, then leaned closer over the counter. "That school bus. It was supposed to head back early, but the route got blocked. Driver tried a shortcut. Haven't heard back from him yet." Eli's stomach knotted. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. If they were caught in this storm, they didn't stand a chance without help. By the time Eli stepped outside, the world had become a wall of white. Snow whipped sideways across the lot, stinging his face. He climbed into his truck and sat there a moment, engine idling, heart thudding hard in his chest. He didn't have to go. Someone else would surely handle it. Someone with better equipment, better training. He was just a carpenter, a struggling single dad who hadn't built anything worth a damn since the day he lost Marissa. But deep inside him, beneath all the scar tissue and weariness, something refused to let him drive away. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. Then he turned the truck toward the back roads, into the storm. Visibility was near zero. He crawled forward at a crawl, wipers beating furiously against the blinding snow. His headlights caught glimpses of barbed wire fences, skeletal trees bent against the wind. His world shrank to a narrow tunnel of light and white fury. And then he saw it, a slash of yellow against the snow. The bus lay on its side in a shallow ravine, half buried by drifts, windows shattered, one back wheel still spinning uselessly in the air. Eli skidded to a halt and jumped out. The cold hit him like a hammer. Fighting through knee-deep snow, he stumbled toward the wreck. There were figures, adults and children, gathered near the broken rear door. Two men were shouting over the roar of the wind, trying to pull debris aside. Most of the kids had been dragged out already, bundled into blankets, faces pale with cold and terror. A heavy-set firefighter clutched Eli's arm as he approached. "We got most of them," he shouted. "Two left inside, twins. But it's too unstable now. The roof's going to cave." Eli didn't hesitate. He ducked past the man's grasp, plunged into the tilted wreck. Inside the bus, the world was a chaos of twisted metal and broken glass. Snow poured through shattered windows like a living thing, filling the space with icy breath. The floor was slick with blood and slush. He spotted them. Two small boys, no more than 7 or 8, wedged beneath a row of crumpled seats. One was crying weakly. The other was terrifyingly still. Eli's heart pounded, but his hands moved steadily. Training kicked in, the kind you earned the hard way, growing up rough, surviving long winters where no help ever came. Stay low. Don't jostle the structure. Move slow. Keep breathing. He reached them carefully, whispering reassurances even as the roof above them groaned ominously. He wrapped his body around them, shielding them from falling shards, and began the brutal crawl backward through the wreckage. Every movement cost him. The cold gnawed at his muscles. Pain lanced through his side where a shard of glass had sliced him open. But Eli didn't stop, didn't dare. He thought of Marissa. He thought of his son back home, waiting. He thought, if I can save them, maybe I can save a part of myself too. Snow howled through the broken shell of the bus as he dragged them out, inch by inch, until finally, he staggered into the open air. Voices shouted. Arms reached. The boys were snatched from his grasp, rushed to safety. And Eli, knees buckling, breath ragged, collapsed into the snow. Above him, the storm raged on, merciless and wild. But somewhere beneath that furious sky, a battered heart still beat strong. A whisper of something warmer than the storm drifted through the night. Hope. The world had blurred into a dizzying white when Eli came to, blinking against the furious onslaught of the storm. Snow stung his eyes, his lips, the open cuts on his hands. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one a desperate fight against the frozen air clawing at his lungs. Somewhere nearby, voices shouted, frantic, overlapping, barely audible over the howling wind. But Eli couldn't focus on them. His gaze clung to the two small figures being bundled hastily into blankets by rescuers. They were alive. A tremor passed through him, not from the cold this time, but something deeper, older, a kind of weeping inside his chest, silent and breaking. He let his head fall back into the snow, too tired to move, too grateful to care. Then, through the roar of the blizzard, came a sound that didn't belong. At first it was just a vibration, an odd, throaty growl threading through the chaos. Then headlights cut through the wall of white, blazing like twin suns. A car. No. A Mustang. The silver body shimmered like a ghost as it barreled down the narrow country road, tires throwing plumes of snow behind it. The Mustang fishtailed slightly as it screeched to a halt at the crash site, and from the driver's side, a woman leapt out. She wasn't dressed for a blizzard, jeans, boots, a thick cable-knit sweater, and yet she hurled herself into the storm without a second thought, moving with a desperate, feral energy. "Where are they?" she cried, her voice slicing clean through the noise. A firefighter rushed toward her, trying to block her path, but she shoved past him with surprising strength. Eli, struggling to lift himself onto one elbow, watched as she found the boys, her boys, wrapped in thin thermal blankets, their tiny faces pale and blood-smeared. The woman dropped to her knees in the snow, arms wide open, gathering them into her chest, as if trying to fuse them back into herself. She sobbed their names, Caleb, Daniel, over and over, her body rocking with the force of her relief and terror. Eli felt his throat tighten painfully. He shouldn't be watching. This was their moment, sacred and private. And yet he couldn't look away. He saw the way her hands trembled as she checked them for injuries, the way her lips brushed their foreheads again and again, as if reassuring herself they were real, they were breathing. And then, slowly, her head lifted. Their eyes met across the swirling void of the storm. It wasn't the look of a stranger meeting a rescuer. It wasn't even gratitude, not at first. It was something raw, something elemental, recognition. As if for a moment she could see straight into the heart of him, the battered, lonely man lying broken in the snow, and understand the cost of what he had done. She rose unsteadily to her feet, cradling her sons against her, and stumbled toward him. The rescuers shouted warnings, tried to herd her back to the safety of the ambulance, but she ignored them all. She reached Eli and dropped to her knees beside him, her breath coming in sobs that turned to white mist in the frozen air. "You're hurt," she said hoarsely, reaching out as if to touch his bleeding temple, then pulling back in horror at the sight of his bloodied hands. Eli tried to smile, a crooked, broken thing. "They're safe," he rasped. The woman's face crumpled. Without thinking, she leaned in and wrapped him in a fierce, trembling hug. Awkward, messy, but real. He stiffened, caught off guard, but then, slowly, almost unwillingly, let himself sink into the embrace. For one heartbeat, he allowed himself to feel it. The warmth of another soul pressing against his, the fierce gratitude, the unspoken bond forged in ice and blood and impossible courage. "Thank you," she whispered against his ear. "You saved my boys. You saved everything." A medic appeared, tugging gently at her shoulder. "Ma'am, please, we need to get him to the hospital." Reluctantly, she pulled away, brushing a sleeve across her tear-streaked face. She watched as they lifted Eli onto a stretcher, securing an oxygen mask over his face. As they wheeled him toward the waiting ambulance, the woman clutched her sons tightly, whispering promises he couldn't hear. But Eli caught one last glimpse of her through the blowing snow, standing tall, unbowed by the storm, a silver Mustang gleaming at her back like some mythic steed. He smiled faintly behind the oxygen mask. Maybe, just maybe, this broken, battered world still had some miracles left after all. And maybe, just maybe, he had found his. The world inside the ambulance was a blur of noise and lights. Eli Turner drifted in and out of consciousness, sensations coming to him as if from a great distance. The sharp bite of an IV needle, the muffled bark of orders between paramedics, the thin, mechanical beep of a heart monitor, keeping stubborn rhythm with his pulse. Through it all, two small faces hovered at the edge of his awareness, fragile and shivering yet alive. The boys. He had gotten them out. The thoughts settled over him like a heavy, frayed quilt, soothing the raw edges of his mind. It didn't matter what happened to him now. They were safe. The ambulance bumped violently, jostling him on the gurney. A paramedic leaned over him, speaking words he couldn't quite catch. Eli tried to respond, but found his body uncooperative, heavy as stone. It didn't matter. He let his eyes drift closed, surrendering to the cold pull of exhaustion. When Eli woke again, it was to the sharp, antiseptic brightness of a hospital room. The walls were a sterile white, the sheets tucked too tightly around him. Machines beeped steadily nearby. Through the narrow window he could see nothing but a wall of white swirling against the glass, the blizzard still raging outside. For a long moment, he simply lay there, cataloging the damage. Cracked ribs, a dozen lacerations stitched closed, bruised muscles screaming at the slightest movement. But he was alive. He turned his head carefully, wincing, and found himself staring at a chair pulled up beside his bed. In it sat the woman from the Mustang. She looked different without the blizzard tearing at her, smaller somehow, more human. Her blonde hair was damp, curling slightly around her shoulders. Dark circles bruised the delicate skin under her eyes, but there was a fierce, unyielding light in them still. She was watching him. Had been, it seemed, for some time. When she saw him stir, she set aside the coffee cup she was cradling and leaned forward. "Hey," she said softly, voice rough with sleeplessness. "You're awake." Eli licked his cracked lips, his throat dry as sand. "The boys, they're fine," she said quickly, a tremor of emotion threading through her words. "A few cuts and bruises, mild hypothermia, but they're going to be okay." Relief flooded him so hard it almost hurt. He closed his eyes briefly, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. When he opened them again, she was still there, studying him with a mixture of gratitude, awe, and something else he couldn't quite name. "You saved them," she whispered. "When everyone else gave up, you didn't." Eli shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. Praise always sat poorly with him. He hadn't saved those boys for thanks. He'd saved them because it was the right thing to do, because he couldn't bear the thought of leaving them behind in that frozen tomb. "Anyone would have done the same," he muttered. "No," she said, her voice firm. "They wouldn't have. I saw the fear in their eyes. I saw how everyone stood back, except you." She leaned back in her chair, wrapping her arms around herself as if cold. For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the hum of machines and the distant howl of the storm beyond the window. Finally she spoke again, her voice quieter, more tentative. "My name's Savannah," she said. "Savannah Lee." Eli nodded slightly. "Eli Turner." Savannah gave a small, almost shy smile. "I guess introductions usually come before heroic rescues," she said. A corner of Eli's mouth twitched upward. "Better late than never." Another quiet fell between them, but this time it was not uncomfortable. It was the quiet of two people who had been through something vast together, something words couldn't quite contain. Savannah hesitated, then reached into the oversized bag at her feet and pulled out a battered toy truck. Its bright red paint was chipped, its wheels wobbly. "My sons," she said, cradling it in her hands. "Caleb and Daniel. They wouldn't let this go, even when the medics were trying to warm them up." She set the truck carefully on the bedside table, as if it were a sacred offering. Eli looked at it, at the way her fingers lingered on the chipped plastic, and felt something inside him shift. A tenderness he hadn't allowed himself in a long time stirred beneath the weight of his weariness. He thought of his own boyhood, the rough-hewn toys his father carved by hand, the way he used to clutch them tight during the long, freezing winters. The world, it seemed, was built not on grand victories, but on small, stubborn acts of love. The door opened then, and a nurse bustled in, bringing warmth and the smell of fresh linens. "Good to see you awake, Mr. Turner," she said briskly, checking the machines. "Doctor'll be in soon. We'll probably keep you a few more days, just to be safe." Savannah stood, brushing her hands on her jeans. "I'll give you some rest," she said. But there was a question in her voice, an unspoken, "Will you let me stay?" Eli, against all instincts honed by years of solitude, found himself nodding. She smiled. A real one this time, bright and a little crooked. "I'll be back," she promised, and slipped out into the corridor, leaving behind the faint scent of winter and hope. Alone again, Eli let his eyes drift closed. For the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. Maybe the blizzard hadn't just brought destruction. Maybe it had brought something else, too. Something worth hoping for. Something worth staying awake for. The blizzard raged on for 2 more days. Inside the small hospital room, time seemed to move differently. Slower, heavier, like the thick snow pressing against the windows. Eli Turner drifted through cycles of sleep and wakefulness, pain and dull comfort, never quite sure how much time had passed between the quiet comings and goings of nurses. But there was one constant, Savannah Lee. She came every day, always with the same quiet determination. Sometimes she brought her boys, Caleb and Daniel, their cheeks pink from the cold, their hands full of paper cranes and crayon drawings for Mr. Eli. Sometimes she came alone, carrying coffee that was always too strong and pastries from the diner across the street. They didn't talk much, not at first. Savannah would sit by his bed, leafing through battered paperbacks or mending a loose button on one of her son's jackets, while Eli rested. There was a comfort in her presence, a steady, unspoken rhythm that filled the empty spaces without demanding anything from him. Eli wasn't used to that. He wasn't used to kindness that didn't come with expectations. On the 3rd morning, Eli woke to find Savannah standing at the window, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of snow-muted light. She turned when she heard him stir, offering a tentative smile. "Storm's breaking," she said, nodding toward the pale sky beyond the frost-smeared glass. Eli shifted carefully, the stiff ache in his ribs flaring. "Good," he said, voice rough. "Town must be half buried by now." Savannah chuckled softly. "Pretty much. They're already talking about calling in the National Guard for cleanup." She hesitated, then crossed back to the chair beside his bed, her fingers twisting together. "My boys," she said, voice quieter now. "They haven't stopped talking about you." Eli blinked, startled. "They say you're like Superman," Savannah continued, her smile bittersweet. "Only, without the cape." Eli huffed a dry laugh. "Hardly." But warmth crept into his chest, unexpected and unfamiliar. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had done what needed to be done. Nothing more. And yet, to these boys, to their mother, he had become something larger than the sum of his scars. Savannah sat down, studying him with that unflinching gaze of hers. "You know," she said slowly, "when I saw you lying there in the snow, I thought you were gone." Her voice caught on the last word, and she pressed her lips together tightly for a moment before continuing. "I don't know how you did it," she whispered, "how you got them out, how you survived that." Eli shifted, uncomfortable under the weight of her words. "It wasn't heroics," he said, staring at his hands, the bandages wrapped around them. "It was instinct. You see someone who needs help, you help them. That's it." Savannah shook her head, a strand of hair falling across her forehead. "It's not that simple," she said. "Not everyone would have done what you did. Most people—" She faltered, then drew a shaky breath. "Most people are too scared, too selfish." Eli said nothing. Inside, he knew she was right. It had been terrifying, plunging into that wreckage, feeling the bus shudder and creak under the weight of the storm. Every instinct had screamed at him to turn back, to save himself. But there had been two small figures trapped in the cold, two little lives, too precious to abandon. He would rather have died than leave them there. Savannah leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Please," she said, "let me do something for you. Anything." Eli shook his head automatically. "You don't owe me anything." But Savannah's mouth set into a stubborn line. "I do," she said. "We do." Before he could argue further, the door creaked open and a nurse poked her head inside. "Mr. Turner, there's someone asking to speak with you." Eli frowned. "Who?" The nurse shrugged. "Says she's with the sheriff's office." Savannah stood quickly. "I'll give you some privacy," she said, gathering her things. Eli watched her go, a strange hollow ache blooming in his chest, as the door clicked shut behind her. Minutes later, a woman in a tan sheriff's uniform stepped inside. She was small and wiry, her face weathered by sun and wind, her badge gleaming against her heavy coat. "Mr. Turner," she said, nodding, "I'm Deputy Martin. I just wanted to personally thank you." Eli raised an eyebrow. "You probably don't know this," she continued, pulling a chair closer to his bed. "But those two boys you saved? They're Savannah Lee's sons." Eli nodded cautiously. "And Savannah," the deputy said, her voice dropping slightly, "isn't just anybody around here. Her late husband was the mayor. She runs half the town's charities, funds the library, the shelter, the food pantry, quietly, without asking for attention." Eli blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected that. Deputy Martin smiled slightly. "You didn't just save two kids," she said. "You saved the heart of this town." She stood then, tipping her hat slightly. "If there's anything you ever need," she added, "you come find me." And then she was gone, leaving Eli alone with a head full of thoughts he couldn't quite untangle. As he lay there, staring at the ceiling, the door opened once more. Savannah stepped back inside, her hair mussed from the wind, cheeks flushed. She held out a steaming cup of coffee. "Truce?" she said with a small, hopeful smile. Eli found himself smiling back, a real smile this time, slow and reluctant, and a little amazed. "Truce," he agreed. And somewhere deep inside him, in a place that had been cold and dark for far too long, something cracked open, something that felt an awful lot like hope. The days that followed blurred into a quiet, snow-muted rhythm. The hospital had become a strange kind of sanctuary, sealed off from the outside world by drifts of blizzard-whipped snow. Inside, life shrank down to smaller things. The steady beep of machines, the scrape of chairs, the low murmur of nurses exchanging shift reports. And Savannah Lee. Every morning she was there, sitting by Eli's bedside with coffee too strong, pastries too sweet, and a light in her eyes he couldn't quite explain. They talked more now. About small things at first. How Caleb loved dinosaurs, and Daniel insisted on sleeping with a nightlight, even though he swore he wasn't scared of the dark. About the long winters in Montana. About the good years before the town fell on harder times. Savannah spoke with a kind of fierce pride about her boys, about the life she had rebuilt from the ashes of her husband's death. And Eli listened, surprised by how much he wanted to know everything about her. One afternoon, as the blizzard finally began to wane, Savannah arrived with a surprise. In her hands she carried a battered leather journal. "I thought you might be bored," she said, setting it carefully on the tray beside his bed. "It belonged to my grandfather. He was a carpenter too. Used to sketch out ideas, write notes, stories sometimes." Eli touched the worn cover with reverence. Something about the gesture, simple, unassuming, reached deeper into him than any grand gesture could have. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. Savannah smiled, a soft, knowing curve of her lips, and sat back in her chair with the easy grace of someone who intended to stay a while. Outside, the wind had stilled, and sunlight, weak and pale, filtered through the frosted windows. Later that evening, long after visiting hours had officially ended, Eli found himself alone with his thoughts. He opened the journal. Inside were pages yellowed with age, filled with neat, careful handwriting and rough sketches of rocking chairs, tables, cradles, dreams made solid by calloused hands and stubborn hearts. Eli traced one sketch with his fingertip. A simple crib, beautifully crafted, the wood grain carefully rendered in pencil. A crib. The memory struck him with the force of a hammer. Marissa, heavy with child, laughing as she picked out paint colors for the nursery. The way he had built a cradle by hand, pouring every ounce of love and hope he had into the grain of the wood. He had buried that cradle with her. He hadn't touched a piece of wood since. The room seemed to contract around him, the air heavy with memories and grief. His chest tightened, a pressure building behind his ribs until he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He fumbled for the call button but missed, his fingers clumsy and trembling. The monitor beside his bed beeped wildly, the pitch rising. The door slammed open, and Savannah was there, faster than the nurse. "Eli!" she gasped, rushing to his side. He couldn't speak, could barely see. Savannah grabbed his hand, squeezing hard. "Hey, look at me, stay with me." The nurse shoved an oxygen mask over his face, barking orders, but it was Savannah's voice that anchored him. Her hands warm and firm, her voice low and steady, cutting through the rising tide of panic. "You're okay," she said fiercely. "You're safe. I'm here. You're not alone." Slowly, painfully, the world steadied. The pressure eased. His heart found its rhythm again. Eli squeezed her hand weakly, tears stinging his eyes, half from pain, half from something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Trust. After the nurses settled him, after the machines calmed their shrill alarms, Savannah stayed. She pulled her chair close, resting her forehead lightly against the back of his hand. They stayed like that for a long time, saying nothing. Finally, Eli found his voice, hoarse but sure. "I haven't built anything since," he swallowed hard, "since Marissa died." Savannah looked up, her eyes shining but steady. "You built something when you saved my boys," she said softly. "You built hope. You built a future." Eli closed his eyes, overwhelmed. He had thought he was broken beyond repair. But maybe, just maybe, the pieces of him could be fit back together. Maybe all it took was someone willing to hold them steady long enough for him to try. The next morning, Eli sat propped up in bed, the journal open on his lap. His fingers, still clumsy with stiffness, gripped a pencil. He stared at the blank page for a long moment, then slowly, tentatively, began to draw. Not a cradle, not a rocking chair, a small, simple table. Something new, something waiting to be filled with stories yet to come. Savannah watched from the doorway, a soft smile playing at her lips. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. And somewhere deep inside him, beyond the ache and the scars, beyond the frozen breath of the storm, Eli Turner took a long, steady breath. A new breath. A breath full of life. The first morning Eli stood on his own feet again. The world tilted sideways. Pain rippled through his ribs, and his legs trembled under his weight. But he clenched his jaw and stayed upright. The nurse hovering nearby reached out instinctively, but he shook his head, managing a faint smile. "I've got it," he rasped. She nodded approvingly, stepping back just enough to let him reclaim a sliver of dignity. Every step Eli took down the sterile hallway felt like a small act of rebellion against the months, years of grief and inertia that had frozen his life into something brittle and small. He was moving again, breathing again, and it mattered more than he had realized. At the end of the hall, in a waiting area with faded armchairs and wilting potted plants, Savannah sat with her boys. Caleb and Daniel were deep into a battle with a battered deck of Uno cards, their faces flushed with excitement. Savannah glanced up, and when she saw Eli, her entire face lit up, so bright and beautiful it stole the breath from his lungs more effectively than the blizzard ever had. She rose immediately, careful not to alarm him, meeting him halfway with a smile that spoke volumes, pride, encouragement, and something else simmering beneath the surface. "You're up," she said softly, her voice threaded with wonder. "Couldn't let you have all the fun," Eli muttered, grimacing as he eased into a chair nearby. The boys noticed him then, dropping their cards with squeals of delight. "Mr. Eli," Daniel shouted, launching himself forward. Caleb was only a beat behind, both boys wrapping themselves around Eli's legs in a tangle of arms and laughter. Eli froze for a second, overwhelmed by the simple, fierce warmth of it. No one had touched him like this in years, without fear, without pity, without expectation. Just love, raw and pure and utterly disarming. Carefully he ruffled their hair, blinking hard against the sting in his eyes. Savannah watched the scene unfold, her heart folding in on itself in ways she hadn't thought possible. She remembered the night after the accident, when she'd sat awake in a hospital chair, staring at her sleeping sons, wondering how she would ever thank the man who had dragged them back from the edge of death. Now she knew. You didn't pay back miracles. You paid them forward. Later that afternoon, when the boys were safely ensconced in the hospital's tiny playroom, Savannah found herself sitting beside Eli once more, their knees brushing in the cramped space. "You should be home, resting," Eli said quietly. Savannah shook her head. "Home can wait." Eli studied her face, the dark smudges beneath her eyes, the fine lines etched deeper by worry and weather and life. "You're carrying too much," he said before he could stop himself. She blinked, startled. "I'm fine." "You don't have to be," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Not all the time." Savannah looked away, staring out the window where the snow still clung stubbornly to the world. "I don't know how to not be," she admitted after a long pause. "My whole life it's been about being strong, for my boys, for everyone." Eli nodded slowly. "I get it," he said. "When Marissa died, I thought if I just kept moving, kept fixing things, I could outrun the hurt. But it doesn't work like that." Savannah turned back to him, her expression raw. "How do you fix a heart?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Eli smiled sadly. "You don't," he said. "You let someone hold the broken pieces with you until they don't cut so deep anymore." The words hung between them, fragile and trembling. Savannah blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. But for once she didn't hide the ache. She let it show. And Eli, steadily, quietly, reached out. His hand covered hers, calloused and scarred and warm. No promises, no grand declarations, just presence, just the steady, stubborn belief that broken things could still be beautiful. That evening, as the last fingers of sunlight stretched across the snow-drowned fields, Savannah bundled Caleb and Daniel into their coats. Eli watched from his wheelchair near the door, an ache blooming in his chest. He hated goodbyes, hated the way they hollowed him out, leaving him emptier than before. But Savannah didn't say goodbye. She crouched down to hug her boys, whispering something that made them giggle, then straightened and crossed to him. "We're not leaving yet," she said, as if reading his mind. "The roads are still a mess. We're staying at my sister's place a few blocks from here." Eli nodded, relief he didn't dare name sweeping through him. Savannah hesitated, then leaned in, pressing a kiss to his cheek, a soft, fleeting touch that left a scorch in its wake. "Get some rest," she murmured. And then she was gone, a swirl of laughter and wool and hope. Eli sat there long after the automatic doors hissed shut, the ghost of her kiss warming him against the bitter cold outside. For the first time in years, he didn't dread what tomorrow might bring. For the first time, he wanted to stay awake to see it. The snow had stopped falling 3 days ago, but the town was still buried beneath a thick white silence. Eli Turner sat by the window of his hospital room, watching workers in heavy parkas shovel paths through the streets, their breath puffing into the cold air like smoke signals. The world was stirring again, slowly waking from the storm's long sleep. He should have felt the same. Instead, a restless unease gnawed at him, growing sharper with every passing hour. Tomorrow, the doctors had said, he could be discharged, back into a life he barely recognized anymore. And for the first time since he pulled those boys from the wreckage, Eli was afraid. Savannah Lee arrived just after noon, carrying a paper bag from the diner and her usual bright energy. The boys trailed behind her, Caleb clutching a stack of coloring books, Daniel dragging a battered stuffed dinosaur by the tail. "Room service," Savannah announced cheerfully, setting the bag on the small table by the bed. "Today's special, grilled cheese and bad coffee." Eli chuckled despite himself. The boys clambered into chairs, chattering about the snow forts they were building at their aunt's house. Eli listened, letting their excitement wash over him, warming the cold spaces inside his chest. But Savannah noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands fidgeted with the blanket. When the boys were distracted, she leaned closer. "You okay?" she asked softly. Eli hesitated. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he said it. "I don't know where to go." Savannah blinked, taken aback. He pushed forward, the words spilling out rough and low. "I lost my home last year. Couldn't keep up with payments after Marissa. I've been living out of a trailer, working odd jobs. No real address, no real anything." He swallowed hard, staring at his hands. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to think—" He shook his head, frustration tightening his throat. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." Savannah was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out, laying her hand over his. "You saved my family, Eli," she said simply. "That makes you part of it now." He looked up, startled. Her eyes were steady, unwavering. "You're not alone anymore," she said. "If you want it, you have a place with us." Eli felt something inside him crack, a fault line giving way under the weight of years. He opened his mouth to argue, to refuse out of habit, but Savannah squeezed his hand lightly. "Don't think about pride," she said, almost smiling. "Think about second chances." Eli closed his eyes briefly, the tide of emotion too fierce to face head-on. When he opened them again, Savannah was still there, waiting, believing in him, something he hadn't even dared to do for himself in a long, long time. That night, after the boys had been bundled back to their aunt's house, and the nurses had dimmed the hallway lights, Eli lay awake staring at the ceiling. Memories ghosted through the room like mist. The hollow sound of an empty house, the scrape of eviction notices against a battered door, the quiet, aching loneliness that no amount of work or exhaustion could ever quite smother. He thought of Marissa, her laugh, The way she used to believe he could build anything with his hands. He had built walls around himself after losing her, built them high and strong, convinced no one could or should climb over. But Savannah hadn't asked permission. She had simply walked through the wreckage, unafraid, carrying warmth in her hands, carrying hope. Eli rose carefully from the bed, wincing at the pull of stitches and bruised muscles. The journal Savannah had given him lay on the side table, a pencil tucked into its spine. He opened it to a fresh page. At first he just sat there, pencil poised but unmoving. Then, slowly, he began to sketch. Not a cradle this time, not a table, a home, simple lines, solid beams, a place built not just from wood and nails, but from second chances and stubborn hope. He worked slowly, deliberately, his hand steady despite the tremors of exhaustion. When he finally set the pencil down, he sat back and studied the page. It wasn't perfect. Neither was he. But it was real. And for the first time in years, he wanted something real. The next morning, when Savannah arrived with coffee and laughter and a smile that could melt glaciers, Eli was waiting. He held up the journal, open to the sketch. "I don't have much," he said, voice rough with emotion. "But if you'll have me, I'd like to build something with you." Savannah stared at the page, then at him, and in that moment, the last of the walls between them crumbled. She crossed the room in 2 quick steps and wrapped her arms around him, careful of his injuries but not of her heart. "We'll build it together," she whispered. Outside the window, the snow was already beginning to melt, revealing patches of stubborn green beneath the white. Life fighting its way back, just like them. Leaving the hospital was harder than Eli had expected. Not physically, though every step still pulled at his ribs and echoed in his bones, but in ways he couldn't quite name. The hospital had been a strange cocoon, a place where the outside world, with all its sharp edges and uncertainties, was kept at bay. Out there, real life waited, and Eli wasn't sure if he was ready to meet it. Savannah met him at the discharge doors, her arms full of a heavy winter coat and a pair of sturdy boots she'd picked up somewhere. Her boys danced around her legs like happy puppies, shrieking with laughter as they pelted each other with handfuls of leftover snow. Eli stood for a moment, leaning heavily on the crutch they'd given him, and just watched. The low winter sun gilded Savannah's hair with the light, and her smile when she saw him was so open, so full of something he didn't dare name yet, that he felt his throat tighten. He hadn't been part of a scene like this in so long, had almost forgotten what it felt like to belong somewhere without having to earn it, or apologize for needing it. Savannah crossed the snowy drive in a few quick steps, thrusting the coat at him. "Come on," she said, grinning. "We're not letting you freeze out here." Eli shrugged into the coat with some difficulty, and Savannah knelt to help lace up his boots without asking permission, her fingers deft and sure. He wanted to protest. He hated being fussed over, but something in the way she moved, quiet and unassuming, stopped him. She wasn't treating him like he was broken. She was treating him like he mattered. The ride to Savannah's house, or rather her sister's borrowed house, was short and bumpy, the snow-packed streets turning every turn into a gamble. Savannah drove like she lived, steady, fearless, and with just enough recklessness to keep things interesting. Eli sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his crutch tucked awkwardly between them, and tried not to feel like an intruder. He needn't have worried. The boys chattered from the back seat about snow forts and sledding, and the amazing rescue mission Eli had apparently conducted single-handedly against avalanches, wolves, and maybe a dragon or two, depending on who was telling the story. Eli caught Savannah's eye in the rearview mirror, and they both laughed. A real, unguarded laugh that felt like sunlight cracking through a storm cloud. Savannah's sister's place was small but warm. A tidy 2-bedroom cottage nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac, half buried in snowdrifts. Inside, the air smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, throwing golden light across worn hardwood floors and cozy furniture. Eli stood awkwardly just inside the door, unsure where to put himself. But Savannah solved that by simply reaching out, taking his hand in hers, and leading him to the couch without ceremony. "Sit," she ordered. "Rest." And he did. Because somehow when Savannah asked, it didn't feel like surrender. It felt like trust. The afternoon slid into evening. Savannah brewed coffee and reheated soup while the boys constructed elaborate pillow forts that quickly swallowed half the living room. Eli sat and watched it all unfold around him, a growing warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was life. Messy, loud, imperfect. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he wanted to be part of it. After dinner, simple sandwiches and canned soup that somehow tasted better for being shared, Savannah tucked the boys into sleeping bags inside their fortress and drifted back to the couch. Eli shifted to make room, grimacing at the pull in his side. "You sure you're okay?" Savannah asked, a frown creasing her brow. He nodded. "Better every day." She hesitated, then sat down beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body seep through the layers of fabric between them. For a long moment, they sat in silence. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the boys' soft giggles from their fort. Then Savannah spoke, her voice low and hesitant. "I'm scared," she admitted. Eli turned his head, surprised. "You don't seem it." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "That's the trick, isn't it? You keep moving, keep smiling, and maybe no one notices you're just trying to hold everything together with duct tape and prayers." Eli understood that better than he cared to. He shifted, wincing a little, and turned fully toward her. "You don't have to do it alone anymore," he said quietly. Savannah looked at him then, really looked, and whatever she saw made her shoulders sag, the fight draining out of her. "I don't know how to let someone in," she whispered. Eli reached out, slow and careful, and took her hand. "You don't have to know," he said. "You just have to try." Her fingers curled around his, tentative at first, then firmer, as if afraid he might vanish if she let go. Eli squeezed back, a promise without words. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Outside, the snow had finally stopped falling, the night sky clearing to reveal a blanket of stars so bright it hurt the eyes. And inside, on an old couch in a borrowed house, 2 broken people sat together, holding tight to the fragile, flickering miracle of hope. The morning after the storm, the world outside looked transformed. A glittering expanse of untouched snow, draped over rooftops and trees like a fresh beginning. Inside Savannah's borrowed cottage, the air was warm with the sense of coffee brewing and bacon sizzling on the stove. Laughter floated from the living room, where Caleb and Daniel were busy demolishing last night's pillow fort in fits of giggles. Eli Turner stood at the window, a mug of black coffee cradled in his hands, watching as sunlight bounced off the frozen world beyond. There was a quiet inside him he hadn't felt in years, not the heavy, suffocating silence of grief. Something different, something lighter. Hope. Savannah appeared beside him, her own coffee in hand. "They're already asking when you can help them build a real fort outside," she said, smiling up at him. Eli chuckled, feeling a tug at the corners of his heart. "I'll need a few more days to get my strength back," he said. "But after that, they won't know what hit them." Savannah laughed, the sound warm and easy. It amazed him still how natural this all felt, like he had stepped into a life already waiting for him, fitting into place with a kind of quiet inevitability. Later that day, while the boys napped, Savannah pulled a thick folder from the kitchen counter and set it down in front of Eli. "I've been meaning to ask you something," she said, pulling up a chair. Eli raised an eyebrow, wary but curious. Savannah flipped open the folder to reveal a set of blueprints. Floor plans, site maps, detailed drawings. Eli leaned closer, surprised. "What's this?" Savannah hesitated, tucking a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Before everything," she said, "I had this dream. To build a community center here. For families who needed help. Single parents, kids who didn't have anywhere safe to go after school." She tapped the papers, her voice gaining strength. "I started raising money, got permits, found a piece of land on the edge of town. But then, life happened. I lost my husband. The town fell on hard times, and the plans just sat." Eli listened, heart thudding. Savannah looked up at him, her eyes fierce and shining. "I want to start again," she said, "and I want you to help me build it." The room seemed to tilt for a moment, not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of what she was offering. Not charity, not pity, a chance. A real, honest chance to build something that mattered. Eli swallowed hard. "I haven't held a hammer in over a year," he said. Savannah smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "Then it's about time you picked one up again." The next few days passed in a blur of quiet planning and slow healing. Every morning, Eli grew stronger, moving a little easier, breathing a little deeper. Every evening, Savannah sat with him at the kitchen table, poring over designs, making lists, dreaming out loud. It wasn't easy. Doubts crept in like the cold. Was he still good enough? Strong enough? Deserving enough? But every time he faltered, Savannah was there, with a touch, a look, a quiet certainty that anchored him when he lost his footing. And slowly, brick by brick, Eli began to rebuild, not just his body, but his spirit. One snowy afternoon, Eli bundled up and ventured outside for the first time since leaving the hospital. Savannah and the boys cheered like he was conquering Everest, and he laughed, breath clouding the air. The world smelled sharp and clean, the snow squeaking under his boots. Caleb immediately shoved a snowball into Eli's hands. "Build with us!" he demanded, his eyes wide with excitement. Eli grinned and knelt stiffly in the snow, ignoring the twinge in his side. Together they packed snow into walls, carving out a rough fort, lopsided but proud. Daniel clapped his hands in delight. "It's the best fort ever," he declared. Eli sat back on his heels, the boys tumbling around him, and for a moment he let himself simply be. No ghosts, no regrets. Just this. A simple, perfect moment carved out of a broken world. As the sun dipped low, painting the snow in shades of gold and violet, Savannah came outside, her arms crossed against the cold, a soft smile curving her lips. Eli met her gaze across the snow and felt something shift inside him again, something deep, something unshakable, a knowing that whatever storms still waited ahead, whatever battles still had to be fought, he didn't have to face them alone. And maybe, just maybe, love didn't always come wrapped in fireworks or grand declarations. Maybe sometimes it came in the form of small, stubborn miracles, a hand reaching through the wreckage, a smile shared across a field of snow, a heart daring, trembling to beat again. Winter was slow to release its grip on the town. Even as the calendar turned toward spring, the fields remained buried beneath heavy drifts, and the air still tasted of frost. But inside Savannah's cottage, change had already begun. It was in the plans spread across the kitchen table, dog-eared and coffee-stained from hours of dreaming. It was in the way Caleb and Daniel built cities in the living room, from pillow forts and cardboard castles. It was in the way Savannah smiled at Eli across a mug of steaming coffee, her eyes carrying promises she wasn't quite ready to speak aloud, but didn't need to. And it was in Eli himself. Every day he grew stronger, moving with less stiffness, breathing with less effort. More than that, he moved with purpose again, a quiet, steady hum that thrummed through his bones, pulling him forward. One morning after breakfast, and another raucous session of fort building, Savannah handed Eli a worn set of keys. He looked at them, puzzled. "What's this?" She smiled, that slow, secret smile that had a way of undoing him entirely. "Come see." Bundling the boys into their jackets, Savannah led them outside, the snow crunching beneath their boots. They piled into the Mustang, Caleb calling shotgun, Daniel insisting on sitting in Eli's lap, just for a minute. And Savannah steered them through the winding back roads toward the outskirts of town. The land stretched wide and white around them, untouched save for a few wandering deer tracks. At last she pulled up to a fenced-off lot, the ground hidden beneath a glittering sheet of snow. A faded "for sale" sign leaned drunkenly against the fence. Eli climbed carefully from the car, crutch thudding into the snow, and stared. The land was nothing but emptiness right now, but in his mind he could already see it. Wood rising from frozen earth, warm lights glowing against the dusk, a place built with hands and hope and second chances. Savannah joined him, the boys racing ahead to tumble through the drifts. "This," she said, nodding at the lot, "is ours." Eli turned to her, heart hammering. "I used some of the grant money I raised before," she explained. "And, well, I had some savings. It wasn't easy, but—" She shrugged, smiling wryly. "Nothing worth doing ever is." He was still staring at her, stunned, when she pressed the keys into his hand. "You're the builder, Eli," she said softly. "You build the bones. I'll build the heart." For a long moment, he couldn't speak. The weight of the keys, small and heavy in his palm, felt like the weight of a life being handed back to him. Or maybe being offered for the first time. The next few days blurred into a flurry of activity. Savannah made calls to contractors and suppliers. Eli sketched plans late into the night. Caleb and Daniel perched on either side of him, offering enthusiastic and often hilarious suggestions. "Can we have a slide from the second floor?" Daniel asked. "And a secret tunnel," Caleb added. Eli laughed, promising to think about it, even as he tucked those wild, joyful ideas into a corner of his mind where dreams lived. It had been a long time since he'd dared to dream at all. One evening, after the boys had been wrestled into bed and the house had fallen into a rare, peaceful silence, Savannah and Eli sat together on the porch steps, mugs of coffee cradled in their hands. Above them, the stars burned bright and cold against the dark sky. For a while, neither spoke. The quiet between them was easy now, filled with things understood rather than said. Finally, Savannah broke the silence. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "I used to think I had to carry everything alone, that if I let someone else in, it meant I was weak." Eli turned his head, studying her profile in the starlight. "And now?" he asked. She smiled, a small, fierce curve of her lips. "Now I know it's braver to share the weight, and it's lighter when you do." Eli nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep in his chest. He set his mug aside and reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. Savannah squeezed back. No hesitation this time. No fear. Just two hands, weathered and scarred, finding strength in each other. Above them, the night stretched vast and endless. But for the first time in a very long time, neither of them felt small beneath it. They were building something bigger than their pasts, bigger than their pain. They were building something new. Together. Spring didn't come to Montana in a rush. It tiptoed in slowly, melting the edges of snowbanks, coaxing shy green shoots from the frozen earth. The river, once locked beneath thick ice, began to murmur and move again, carrying the promise of new life downstream. And with the thaw, work began. On a still, chilly April morning, Eli Turner stood at the edge of the empty lot, boots planted firmly in the muddy ground, blueprints rolled under his arm. Behind him, Savannah and the boys bustled around with shovels and stakes, marking corners, measuring distances, laughing and bickering in the way only a real family could. Their family. The thought still caught Eli sometimes, like a breathless marvel. Not so long ago he had been adrift, a man surviving one empty day at a time. Now he was here, rooted, needed, loved. The town had turned out to help too. People who remembered what Savannah's late husband had once meant to this place. People who had heard the story of a single father pulling two boys from a frozen tomb when no one else dared. Neighbors dropped off coffee and donuts. Local carpenters volunteered tools. An old man even donated a battered truckload of salvaged lumber. They didn't come because they owed anything. They came because they believed. Believed in rebuilding. Believed in miracles. On the day the first foundation post went in, Savannah called for a break and handed Eli a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. They sat together on an overturned beam, legs stretched toward the fledgling building site. "It's happening," Savannah said, wonder threading through her voice. Eli nodded, biting into his sandwich, chewing slowly. It wasn't just about the walls they would raise or the roof they would hammer into place. It was about the lives that would pass through the doorways they were building. The second chances being stacked beam by beam. It was about choosing to stay, to fight, to believe, again and again. As the sun sank lower, gilding the muddy field in shades of gold, Savannah rose and dusted off her jeans. "I've got something for you," she said, grinning. She dug into the front pocket of her jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. Eli froze, staring. Savannah laughed at his expression. "Relax," she teased. "I'm not proposing." Tentatively, he opened the box. Inside was a simple silver ring, hammered by hand, rough around the edges, but beautiful in its imperfection. Eli lifted his eyes to hers, a question unspoken. Savannah shrugged, suddenly shy. "I just thought you deserved something to remind you that you survived, that you saved us, that you're not walking alone anymore." The air between them thickened with feeling. Eli closed the box carefully and tucked it into the pocket of his jacket without a word. Then he stood, stepping closer. Slowly, deliberately, he took Savannah's hands in his, rough palms cradling her smaller ones with a gentleness that belied his strength. "You saved me too, Savannah Lee," he said, voice roughened by more than the wind. She smiled, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Then I guess we're even." "No," Eli said, shaking his head. "We're just getting started." That night, after the tools were packed away and the boys had been wrestled into baths and tucked into bed, Eli and Savannah sat on the back steps of the cottage, watching the stars reappear. The Mustang gleamed faintly under the porch light, a silent witness to all they had endured and all they had found. Savannah leaned against Eli's side, her head resting comfortably on his shoulder. Eli turned the silver ring over in his fingers, feeling the weight of it. Not heavy, just right. "What's next?" Savannah asked softly. Eli looked out across the dark fields where their dreams were slowly taking shape. Build the center, he said. Raise the roof. Fill it with kids and laughter and second chances. Savannah hummed her agreement against his shoulder. And after that? She pressed. Eli smiled into the dark. Whatever we want, he said. Together. And somewhere deep in the night, beneath the vast Montana sky, a seed of hope, planted in the middle of a blizzard, watered by courage and warmed by love, took root and began to grow, strong, steady, unstoppable, just like them. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to know. Where are you watching from today? It's always a joy to see how far these moments of kindness can travel. If you'd like to hear more stories that warm the heart and lift the spirit, please consider subscribing to Soul Moments Story. We would be honored to have you as part of our growing family. Thank you truly for spending this time with us. Until next time, may your days be filled with hope, kindness, and a little bit of magic.